Okay, Charlotte, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast.
It's lovely to be here.
If
This is my favourite topic, so I'm so excited.
I'm very excited for this topic. It was one that I hadn't touched on yet, so I'm really excited to bring this to the audience. For people that don't know who you are, heaven forbid, could you please just give us a brief overview of who you are, what it is you do?
If people don't know who I am, then where have you been? Like, big time. No,
Okay.
so most people know me from Mac Nutrition. So I was one of Martin McDonald's health and performance nutritionists, worked as a tutor on MNU. So a lot of people will know me from kind of being in the mentoring lab and the student groups and at events. If you bumped into me there, I was usually the one that was asking you to do a video testimonial that people were trying to run away from. So that was me.
Not me.
But prior to that, I have a undergraduate degree in nutritional science and a postgraduate degree in sport and exercise nutrition from Loughborough University. I've been an athlete pretty much my whole life in a variety of sports, dived to a pretty decent level, and now I do things like triathlon and ultramarathon and stuff like that. I've worked with some interesting people along the way, including clubs like Doncaster Rovers. I've worked with some cyclists, delivered seminars, delivered lectures and stuff like that. I do a bit of guest lecturing. I kind of just do everything and anything. Love working with athletes. Not everything and anything.
Just pay me and I
Just
will
pay
do
me,
it.
I'll do anything.
Yeah, let's make sure this podcast doesn't reach the wrong hands because that could be misconstrued quite heavily
Yeah.
when it comes to nutrition.
When it comes to nutrition, I'm pretty much a bit of a jack of all trades. So now I'm a one-to-one nutrition coach.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want someone to help you do an Ironman, I'm probably your girl.
Yeah, definitely. If you're an endurance athlete listening to this and are looking for a next step in terms of endurance nutrition, then Charlotte would definitely be someone to look up. So you talked about being an athlete your entire life, and you mentioned that you're now actually doing ultras and triathlons, things like that.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about, I guess, your background and then how you've reached that point.
So I started life as more of like a strength and power athlete.
Okay.
In gymnastics. So I was a gymnast from the age of about 4, and then kind of got picked up and shoved towards more of a performance gymnastics pathway. And I realized I hated gymnastics. It was horrible.
Right.
You know those documentaries that you see about like Russian gymnasts where they're crying, and it was like that, but slightly less intense.
Right.
So I realized that I liked tumbling and acro, but it didn't really ever kind of click with me. I did okay at it. I got a few bronze medals and stuff. And from there, I had a friend that had transferred from gymnastics into diving through a diving for gymnast program. So
right.
I went to that and I went, I'm never doing that again. And my mum was like, okay. And then about a year later, something else came up and I sort of had the opportunity to try diving again and went back. And this time something clicked a little bit better and I stayed. I think I just got pushed in at too high a level.
Right.
Where it was like, oh, it's your first session, you're going to fall backwards off this 5-meter platform. And I was like, no, I'm not. I think I actually got out early on my very first session because I was like, I don't like this at all.
Right.
This is horrible. And gave up diving when I was 18 because I kept just getting injured. And I got to the point where I decided that I couldn't go through another rehab cycle again. Like I couldn't go through another year of rehabbing my triceps to then get back on the 10-meter platform and tear them again. So I came second at a national age group platform competition. I did okay, so that's national level.
I did okay. I came second at national level.
This is national age group though, so it's not like senior national.
Still, Charlotte, humility and all that.
my last event was Scottish Nationals, and that was the test event for the Commonwealth Games that was going to be in Glasgow. So that was really, really good fun. Really enjoyed that. And from there, I went to university, and I would have loved to have played sport at university, but I also worked a lot, and I really liked working. So I wanted to pick a sport that I didn't have to join a team, and that was also really hard. So obviously that meant I did bodybuilding, as you do. I fell into that. I was like, oh, that looks hard, and it looks like something I could do, so I'm going to do that. So I competed in the bikini class for a couple of years. I think I did one full season of competing. And then sort of half-heartedly started prepping and I was like, no, don't like it. And from there, started running again because I'd really enjoyed running. I started running probably in about 2011, so way before I went to university, and got decent at it. Could run a decently fast 5K, decently fast 10K, and kind of gave it up a little bit when I started bodybuilding because, can't lose the gains. So since then, I picked back up running again.
Cool.
Really, really enjoyed it. Went to Loughborough University and joined the triathlon team. So I did like the Bucks triathlons and duathlons, and was going to do an Ironman, then realised how expensive they are to enter. So I entered an ultramarathon instead when I was hungover. It was the day after it was the day after Martin's tour date in Cambridge, and it was a Sunday, and I was hanging because I think we'd had an event the weekend before as well.
Right.
So I'd done like 2 consecutive weekends of tour dates, which was exhausting. Got back on Sunday and was like curled up in my armchair, and it was the weekend of Race to the Stones. So I saw that and was like, I could do that, and just entered it then and there. So
Life lesson.
That was a 100-kilometer ultramarathon. The best decisions are made as a result of a lot of tequila.
Yeah, life lesson. Don't make performance decisions when you're hungover.
I'm glad that I entered it though, because I've really enjoyed training for it, even though it's been cancelled this year. So I've got another whole year to train for it.
Well, that's good, because, you know, training for long distance events takes a shed load of time.
Mm-hmm. It's also exhausting though, so I'm not even going to touch a training plan for it until the new year.
Right.
Because I'll obviously keep running, but
yeah, like, so keep running non-specifically, but then start tapering, like start specifically training for it that time out.
Yeah, I do feel like if you start training for it any more than about 6 months out, you'll just burn out and you'll get injured. And
yeah,
I was getting to that point anyway, where my IT bands weren't happy, and there's another tendon that goes down the side of your knees that wasn't happy, and I was getting problems with my hip flexors, so I just had to back off a little bit.
Yeah, and I think a lot of endurance athletes listening to this could probably relate to that overuse injury, because just like with strength and power sports, there'll need to be periods of accumulation where you accumulate volume, and then periods of intensity, which are low volume, and then periods of time off. So I think a lot of endurance athletes just accumulate volume all year round and then wonder why they get injured.
Yeah, I definitely suffered a lot with that last year, as in I got a stress fracture in my foot and spent a few months on crutches, and then all the problems with like hip flexors and IT bands and stuff. As in, I was out running one morning and I rang Louis and I was like, Louis, I'm at the hospital, can you come pick me up? Because I'd been out for a run, and it was about 3 miles back to my car, or 2 miles to Loughborough A&E. So I was like, I'm just going to hobble to Loughborough A&E and get someone to pick me up there. So Louis came over, got my car keys, and went and got my car and drove it and picked me up and then took me home, because I just couldn't walk. Like, the side of my knee all swelled up. It was horrific. I thought I dislocated my knee. It was horrendous. It was just tendon inflammation. But
wow.
But yeah, that was not fun.
No, but it's something to be aware of for people that are listening to this. You know, if you're training for these events, I think that's a good point. As you said, they're like 6 months out. But it's funny how you said, I'll start training 6 months out for a 100K event. So surely you've got to have a good base to be able to be that confident in training that short time out.
You do. But if you think about how low intensity the exercise is, if you can run a marathon, then you can probably run a 100-kilometer event. It becomes more of an eating competition at that point. So I've spoken to a lot of marathon runners and ultramarathon runners about this. I spoke to one woman in particular she's called Project Marathon Girl on Instagram, who she won an 250-kilometer ultramarathon multi-day stage event in the Wadi Rum Desert in Jordan. And I spoke to her, and she literally was like, don't start training any more than 6 months out. So you need to keep a good aerobic base. Yeah. So then I'm still going to be training, but I'm not going to be trying to hit those like 30, 40, 50-kilometer distances until I get to 6 months out. No. So I'll do a lot of things like swimming and cycling and running up hills really fast, probably with some backpacks on, and hiking and stuff like that, when all this is over.
Yeah, so like a good variety of training, as you said there. So like long aerobic activity, maybe some short interval anaerobic sprints, but just keeping a decent fitness base, and then specifically starting training that time out, which is a good idea.
Over. I might do some triathlon stuff in the interim period. Just stay fit.
Just a casual triathlon.
Sprint triathlons. I don't like standard.
Yes, okay, yeah. That's the longest endurance event I've ever done, was a sprint tri, and quite fun actually. They're
really good fun, but as soon as you get into standard, you have to like cycle 40 kilometers, and then you have to get up and run 10 kilometers, and I don't really want to do that. Yeah. If I'm going to do it that long, I'd rather just do an Ironman and run a marathon on the end of it.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, same here. Not. I remember getting off the bike at the end of the like, because what is it in the sprint, 20K bike and then a 5K run? Yeah, I remember getting off the bike and my legs being like, whoa, what the hell is happening?
It feels so weird the first time you do it.
It is good fun though. So I mean, let's get into some nutrition stuff then. So in terms of, if you're an endurance athlete listening to this, and you're thinking about what do I need to focus on first? Is there like almost like a layer of priorities we should focus on for endurance athletes in order, like things that they should pay attention to before others?
I think this massively depends on your event, because endurance is such a broad term, because you've got things like, I think 800 meters on the track is considered an endurance event.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Tour de France, which is doing hundreds of kilometers over multiple days. Like, it's a 2-week event versus however long people take to run 800 meters really quickly. So there are these massive discrepancies when we talk about endurance between what endurance actually counts as. So I think it does massively depend on your event. But for something like doing 10 kilometers, 5 kilometers, I think the main priorities there are energy and carbohydrates.
Right.
So you need, some people need to focus on getting enough energy, because some people, depending on what their training's like, just burn through it. And it also depends on like your status as an athlete. Are you an elite athlete? Are you a recreational athlete? Are you just someone who wants to finish a 5K? Those kind of things. Because your proper serious 10K runners will be burning through energy like nobody's business, because they'll be running way further than 10K. They'll be doing really high intensity workouts and stuff like that. Whereas Susan, who just wants to finish the local 10K run for charity, isn't going to necessarily need to kind of think about those things as much. So I think it's more fueling for the work that you're doing, rather than making sure that you get all the calories in. So it's, like fueling appropriately is probably the main priority, I think. And that sort of encompasses fueling around your training and fueling appropriately around that.
Yeah. So I guess talk to us a bit about that, because you said obviously it depends on the distance, which is, a great point, because as you said, an 800 meter run is going to be very different to a triathlon or an ultramarathon. And so talk to us about, fueling for the work required is a great paradigm, great mindset to have. But how do people think about that then? Do they need to be thinking about how many calories they're burning through this event? Is there a way for them to work that out appropriately? Where do they start?
This is really difficult, and this is where a lot of people get stuck. And this is where I, as a coach, also find it difficult, because there isn't one answer, due to how well trained people are and how used to people are with running, kind of with and without. I'm going to use running as an example, just because
use it.
So you need to make sure you're eating enough in the day so that you're not starting your run tired. And then you also need to do things like eat during your event, if that's something that's required. So I wouldn't say that anything sort of under 60 minutes needs any kind of intra-event fuel. So that's eating while you're racing. And then as you pass the hour mark, it kind of is probably sensible to start thinking about that sort of thing. So I don't believe that there's kind of a set formula for working out how much you need to eat during an event. But the guidelines are sort of 30 to 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour, which is, again, where all this sort of stuff becomes difficult, because it's like, okay, 30 to 90, that's a ginormous discrepancy.
Yeah.
It's like, so which end of the spectrum should I be on? So if you're sort of in the 60 to 90 minutes to 2.5 hours sort of range, I'd probably aim for the 60 grams of carbs an hour. And anything over 2.5 hours, you're looking at trying to get in 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour. While you're racing, I'd probably always say you're better over fueling than under fueling.
Yeah.
Because you can massively ruin your race by not having enough available energy. So if you're going to carbohydrate load, don't be shy about it, and try and maximize those carbohydrate stores. And if you go over, it's not a massive problem.
Not
We'll
an
just
issue.
use those carbohydrates. Then obviously longitudinally or chronically, you need to think about body weight. So that might be a factor for you to consider. So if you're trying to lose a bit of weight while you're doing this 10K, like I know a lot of people are using exercise for that at the minute, as in they're using it as sort of like goals that move alongside each other. So I'm going to run a 10K and lose weight.
Yes.
It's actually quite a difficult goal to achieve, because running makes you want to eat everything.
Yeah.
So you then need to start thinking about, this is when you start using BMR formulas and stuff like that, and using METs to work out your energy expenditure. So you can work out the energy expenditure. So if I was going to work out how much energy someone expended over the course of a marathon, for example, what I would do is I'd look at the METs for how fast they were running, and I'm going to assume that's like 6. So the METs say how many calories per kilogram per hour you burn.
Right.
So if I'm a 60 kilogram person. I'm just going to grab my calculator out. I'm
Do
a
it.
60 kilogram person, and I'm burning 6 calories an hour
Mm-hmm.
for 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm burning about 360 kilograms an hour, and then I times that by 4. So over the course of the marathon, I'm probably burning 1,440 calories, which actually isn't that much when you think about it.
No.
That's probably a bit low on that. I just plucked a number out of thin air.
Yeah, because it depends on the speed that you run for METs, doesn't it? It depends on the intensity that you're working out at.
Yeah, massively. So yeah, and then you'll have athletes who are way more adapted to running, so they'll be more efficient, so they'll burn less energy. See, it's this ginormous thing of factors, which is why it's really helpful to have a personalized nutrition program when you're doing something like endurance sport. You need to work with someone for a longer period of time. So it might not be a case of like this 12-week thing. And then obviously like energy expenditure changes as your training changes and you go through those cycles of training that we chatted about earlier. So you're going to need to eat more at some stages when you're doing really long, hard training, and less at other places where you're doing shorter, faster sessions. So yeah, I think the most effective way to monitor is use your body weight.
Yeah.
And during a race is not the time to be losing weight.
No, that's a great point. I mean, there are some really great things that you mentioned there. Like, first of all, this fuel for the work required, that's going to take a bit of time to work out.
Yeah.
So it's like you're going to have to trial different things. And as you said, if you're running for a performance aspect, that's very different from running for a weight loss perspective.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about performance as your main goal, which is where like being clear on your goals for one is a good thing, because as you said, people try to do both. They're trying to perform optimally but lose weight at the same time, and it's like you can't chase those two rabbits at once. You've got to choose one and stick with it. So if you're running for performance based, as you said, you're better off over fueling than under fueling, because you're looking for maximum performance. It doesn't matter about, as you said, over consuming calories and maybe putting on a bit of weight. And then, with that, it's a case of you can trial out this idea of somewhere between 30 grams to 90 grams of carbs per hour, depending on the race duration after an hour, and depending on your status of fitness.
And also depending on what you can tolerate.
Yeah, well, that was my point there. I was just going to say, like 90 grams of carbs is a lot of carbohydrate. Like how are you supposed to consume that every hour while racing? What are the methods that people can do to actually achieve that?
Yes. So if you think about, a lot of people use gels, and there's about 20 to 25, maybe 30 grams in some good gels of carbohydrate in those. So those are things that the majority of people use just because there's some fluid in there. They're really easy to just swallow, easy to get down, and they're really portable as well. So a lot of people I know will use gels. So you can kind of trial which ones you like, which ones taste nice. I use the SIS ones, which are decent. I've never had a problem with those. But some people get massive stomach upsets with them. So when I do kind of longer, if I'm trying to complete a 40, 50 kilometer run or something like that, I'll take actual food with me, because gels get really boring and they're really unappealing. So you can do it with whatever method you like and whatever you can stomach. So I know people that will put carbohydrate or maltodextrin powder in their water, so that they're just constantly drip feeding themselves carbohydrate as they're drinking while they run. But that kind of requires you to carry a water bottle or have a Camelback type thing.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to mention. I had a client training for an ultra, and we talked about getting a backpack system with then like fluid holes. And I said to him, have a combination of carbohydrate and electrolytes within your water, because then you can kind of stay topped up.
Yeah.
But then you've got to think about how much of that you need for the distance you're running, and how heavy that's going to be to carry.
Yeah. So a lot of races do have aid points where you can stop and refill those things. But that requires you to then carry surplus maltodextrin powder or something in your bag. You can get little electrolyte tablets, which are brilliant. And I think electrolytes are massively overlooked when people are doing ultra endurance events.
Yeah,
especially.
I agree.
I know a lot of people that have ruined races because they ran out of sodium and potassium and stuff like that, and just depleted those to the point where they were just getting cramp and they were in pain.
Yeah, and that's
everyone on their first Ironman does it.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because I want to double back to METs just to make sure everyone's kind of got their head around it, because obviously you and I are practitioners and so can talk that language quite quickly. But
I appreciate it. I probably went through that too fast.
No, and it's good. We'll double back on it, but just quickly for those listening, this idea of electrolytes and potassium, sodium, and hydration. Just cover that for us pretty quickly, because I bet a lot of people are thinking, well, I thought I just needed to drink water in order to stay hydrated, but that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, no. So as you sweat, you also sweat out salts.
Hmm.
And salt doesn't just mean table salt. Salt means things like potassium chloride and sodium chloride and magnesium chloride, I think, is one. Just stuff like that. So, but adding in just table salt to your water can massively help to kind of undo that, or to compensate for your losses. So
Hmm.
some people are really salty sweaters. They will sweat out a lot of salts and electrolytes and stuff like that as they're running.
Hmm.
And some people aren't as sweaty and salty. I don't know if you've ever been for a run and then you've licked your lips afterwards and you've gone, oh wow, that's salty, or you can feel it on your face and stuff like that, or you feel like sweat drying and you get this little like salty residue on your skin. That might just be me, but yeah. And I find that a really good gauge of people being dehydrated. If you lick your lips and go, oh, that tastes nice because it's salty. That sounds such a weird thing to do. But if you that's salty, you probably need to take on some salts.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point to make. Then, if that's the case, then you are dehydrated. And it's
Yeah,
funny then, as you said, that actually taking in electrolytes and things like that will improve your hydration, because I bet a
it
lot of
will.
people associate salt with dehydration.
Yeah, no, it helps to improve water retention.
Mm.
So I know a lot of people who've done events where they're drinking and they're just losing everything that they're drinking
Hmm.
through urinary losses because they're not taking on carbohydrate and they're not taking on electrolytes, which is helping to absorb that water because it's being all pulled into cells and stuff like that.
Mm.
So yeah, a good way to avoid performance decrements is to avoid a 2% body weight loss due to
Hmm.
dehydration. And it's kind of that 2% number, which is it's a decent amount of weight. So if a 100 kilogram person was running
Hmm.
and they lost 2 kilos over the course of the run, which isn't impossible to do. If you lose a litre of sweat an hour, that's a kilogram. So if you're running for 2 hours, you can feasibly lose 2 kilos. And that's
Easily.
even less for a smaller person.
Yeah.
So
It,
you need to avoid that, essentially, is what you're trying to do.
that's a great point, because if people again will they won't realize how much body weight is lost with water. They won't realize that direct correlation between liters of water and body weight in kilos, which is a great
Yeah.
point. Is there an easy way for people to measure their water rate losses during a race? Is that something that would be done within this kind of optimization?
So what you do is you measure it during training,
Mm-hmm.
and this changes massively depending on the conditions, but you can get a good idea by doing it a couple of times over the course of your training cycle. I did this with Doncaster Rovers and the results were actually really interesting because everybody's losses were so different. So
That's a good point to make as well, is that this is so individual.
super individual. So what you should do is get on the scales butt naked before you go for your run, and then go for your run. Take a note of how long it was.
Mm-hmm.
So a good way to do it is just to go out and run for an hour or half an hour or some kind of round number. And then immediately, don't drink anything, don't eat anything, take all your clothes off and get on the scales again, butt naked, and weigh yourself again
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and look at the difference between that. So if you start at 60 kilograms and you come back and you're now 59 kilograms and you've been running for an hour, that means that you've lost a kilogram over that hour, which would equate to a litre of sweat, because 1 milliliter of water equates to 1 gram.
Yeah, it's a direct correlation of weight to
Direct.
litre.
Yeah.
Which is a great point. And it's lovely that you said that the simplest way is to do a round number run and not drink, because it makes the equation so simple.
Yeah.
But what I love what you mentioned as well was the fact that this is different depending on the conditions and the type of race.
Yeah.
Because we've then got to think, if it's hotter, if it's more humid, you're going to sweat more. And you're going to use potentially more glycogen, more stored carbohydrate as well because of that.
Yeah. So in hotter conditions, you lose more carbohydrate.
Which is a point then for fueling. You might actually need that higher end of carbohydrate during the run if it's a hotter condition.
Yeah.
But what would be quite useful for people, I guess, then, if they wanted to be really nitty gritty about this kind of thing, would be to run at different paces for different durations and do that same method. But if they were then doing a longer trial race, Charlotte and I aren't going to say, don't drink for 3 hours. You're going to have to include the amount you've drank in that equation, aren't you?
Yeah, you'll have to take that away or add that back on. So if you've lost a kilogram, but you've also drunk 500 milliliters of water, take a measured quantity of water out with you, so that way that you know how much you've actually drunk. So don't just fill the water bottle and be like, oh no, I didn't measure that.
Yeah.
So if you lost a kilogram, but also drunk 500 millilitres of water, you'll need to add that on. So your total losses would have been 1.5 kilograms.
Yeah, great point. And for anyone listening to this who doesn't do endurance but does a team sport or CrossFit, this applies to your training as well.
Yeah.
In that you can measure your sweat loss rates for different styles of training, and then you can have like personalized hydration strategies, which really would put you above the pack when it comes to optimization.
Do you know what something super interesting is as well that I've noticed?
Yeah, go on.
Loads of athletes don't start their training hydrated. That's a huge factor in performance.
Yeah.
Because a 2% dehydration on top of already dehydrated is a ginormous. That means you'll probably could be at like 4% dehydration, which is really, really bad. I had an athlete who we would do his first morning urine, and he'd come in and I was like, this is so dark. Like, what are you doing? And he just didn't ever drink water. And I was like, you need to start, because I was like, are you like tired? And he's like, yeah, I'm pretty tired all the time. So amazing. We're going to improve your hydration and see if we can make you a better athlete by simply just coming to training hydrated and coming to training in a better place. So that's something that is massively overlooked, which frustrates me a lot.
People just don't think about it, do they? Like, they think, oh, I'm tired all the time, I must be iron deficient, or I'm not sleeping enough, or something like that. And it's like, actually, are you drinking enough water? And they're like,
monitor your urine.
Does coffee count? And you're like, no.
It does. Not if it's an espresso, it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, it does if it's a long coffee, yeah, and tea counts, and they have net hydration effects, don't they? But people do seem to neglect that basic point of just drinking enough water can help, as you said. Making sure you're not dehydrated when you start it's like prevention is the best cure, right?
Yeah, definitely. And then don't wait until you're dehydrated to drink. Make sure you're drinking every hour. You can set a schedule if you want while you're racing.
Yeah, and you could set like a timer, couldn't you? I guess on your watch, similar to it would if you're being inactive on a Fitbit, would beep at you to say move.
Yeah, I use if I'm doing long runs, I use something called Run Interval, which is an app, and I can set it for you can set the intervals for whatever you want. So you can set them for like it beeps at you every 10 minutes to change pace, usually is what it does.
Yeah, great.
So yeah, I have it set for every 10 minutes. So if I'm doing a long run, when it beeps at me, just get my Camelback mouth bit and just have a drink. And then I know that it's like, oh, it's beeped a few times now, I should probably have something to eat, especially if I'm doing longer form type stuff.
Yes, that's a good point, because then you've got yourself reminding of when you need to take gels and things like that for during the race fueling strategies, which is great. Let's finally double back then on this whole idea of like, work out how much energy you're actually required to take. So this metabolic equivalent table of exercise you mentioned, METs. I'm just going to mention first off that I found somewhere called metscalculator.com, which actually has a full breakdown in a handy like online table. So you can enter,
so useful.
You can enter your body weight and then choose from the list. So this is from a research study where they basically assigned random figures to measure out how much people burned. And what's really important about that, as you said, I guess, is that depending on the intensity that you run, the speed that you run, and your body weight, you're going to burn a different amount of calories. So I guess that then provides that individual with better. They've got to trial it though, haven't they? Because they've got to think then, measure the speed of your run and then try things and see what works. Yeah,
so you can use things like pace calculators online as well, which I use a lot to go, okay, so I ran this far in this amount of time. How fast was that? Okay, that was 11.3 kilometers per hour. What does that equate to as METs? Because there's a lot of different METs for things like running and cycling as to how fast you did it. And if not, you can kind of just go with the nearest thing. Take a little bit of a stab in the dark as if you know roughly what your speed is. I guess a lot of runners probably know, especially the more advanced runners that are probably going to be thinking about these kind of things.
Yeah, and I guess it's, what would your case be on people using Apple Watches, Polar Watches, Garmin watches, and even the Sunto watches now? Like, because I've had clients send me snapshots of their runs and their cycles, and it says like you've burnt this many calories. And do you find that actually, just because it's just an awareness tool and they're running for a performance base rather than a weight loss perspective, is it okay for them to use that as a base metric just to work off of?
I think it definitely is. So I've used them, and I know people that do use them previously. I have a Garmin bike computer for mine, and that I do find that sometimes overestimates a little bit, because there'll obviously be times when you're going downhill very fast and it's like, oh wow, you're burning so many calories not pedaling using gravity to get down this hill. But I find that for running it tends to be a little bit more accurate, or it tends to be closer to what I'd calculate myself. if I was going to calculate how much energy I'd expended on a run. So I think, yes, use it, but take it with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, and it's that good point again of like, if you're doing this for performance aspects, it doesn't matter if it overestimates it, because you're better off over-fueled than under-fueled.
Yeah,
And
100%.
I think that's where people get like, they get themselves mixed up, is that they're like, oh, but this energy calculator online said I burnt this, but my watch says this. Which one's accurate? Which one's the one I should go for? And because you get a lot of nutritionists who are talking about weight loss who say, don't worry about your exercise burn from a good perspective, because they don't want people to eat back their exercise or overeat back. You then almost have the endurance camp being like, what do we do? Where do we go?
Yeah, if you are trying to fuel for performance, it's probably quite useful to eat back your exercise, because otherwise you're just putting yourself in a bad place for the next day. What I tend to do is I'll use like an arbitrary number. So I've kind of worked out that at my body weight, I probably burn about 550 to 600 calories an hour, depending on how fast I'm running. And I just use that. And that's kind of something that I picked up through experience. And I'll use that with clients as well. So I know that if I'm out on the bike, I'll probably go through about 500 to 600 calories an hour, similar when I'm running. And I just use that as a figure.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's so much easier than stressing about the minutiae
Yeah.
of, oh, well, this time I only burnt 497, but the time after I burnt 524, so I need to like make, it's not a big difference at all. It doesn't matter.
No, like 30 calories here or there isn't really going to be a big issue. So if you've got like a nice round figure, as you said, as an estimate to work off of, that's pretty useful.
Yeah.
And it's, as you said, like if people are, what I find interesting is, as you said, people using endurance training for weight loss, and what you said there about like your hunger can just go through the roof. And so it's not actually that much of a viable strategy.
Yeah.
But if someone was doing that, what would you say to them? Would you say that, well, we're still going to have to only manage like a moderate deficit because of the amount you're exercising? You're going to have to be aware of your hunger. Like, how would you manage that with someone?
So what I generally do in that kind of situation is, this is a little bit unorthodox and goes against what a lot of people are taught, but I'll just make their activity factor. So when you're calculating your total daily energy expenditure, I'm assuming you've kind of chatted about this previously on podcast, you work at your BMR, and then you apply an activity factor to that. So like your daily activity. So say someone has a really sedentary job, they just kind of sit at the desk all day, but they might get about 4,000 or 5,000 steps in a day. Give them like an activity factor of 1.2-ish maybe. What I'd do is I'd just increase the activity factor slightly. So it's not an exact science. This is what I think a lot of people get so hung up about, is it's not exact at all. You have to just take an educated guess and then work from there. So I'd probably put their activity up to like 1.4, 1.5, depending on what their training was like, how far they were running and stuff like that. And just increase their calories a bit more, so they were in a less severe deficit than if we weren't looking at their exercise at all. Yeah. So it's like adding back in a portion of that. And then focusing on whereabouts around your running you're eating. So making sure that it's like periodizing calories around your exercise. So eating prior to a run, to make sure that you've got exercise energy for that run, and then recovering properly afterwards. And then maybe being a little bit hungrier if you run first thing in the morning, like having a good breakfast, running, having a solid lunch for your recovery meal strategy, being a little bit hungrier in the evening, or having a smaller dinner, because you probably focus the majority of your calories around your run and around your training.
That is a great point, because that's something that gets banded around, isn't it? If this whole thing of like your timing of food doesn't matter. And although that is correct for a sedentary individual who's looking to lose weight, they could probably, eat when they want, as long as they're managing calories. As you said there, if you're trying to do any activity, but you're in a deficit, you are best prioritizing more of your energy before and after that activity in order to fuel correctly and recover properly. And then you've then got to think about an adherence standpoint and enjoyment standpoint of, when do you want to exercise if you want more calories in the evening? And again, that's where individualization comes in. Yeah.
So you can massively reduce the quality of your training by just not fueling appropriately around it. And that doesn't matter sort of as much if you're having days where you're just doing like easy miles or stuff like that, but you can massively impair the quality of things like interval sessions by not fueling appropriately. And interval sessions is where you get most of the gain.
Yeah, that's a good point, because again, if you're intensely training, you're going to need more energy.
Yeah, you need more carbohydrate to do that. And if you want to get to those upper intensities, doing things like repeated sprints or repeated intervals, then you're going to need that carbohydrate to do that, because that's the main fuel source.
Yeah, good point. I mean, there's a couple of things I wanted to touch on that, because before, when we were talking about longer runs, you mentioned something called carbohydrate loading, and
Hmm.
making sure that you were adequately fueled before starting the race, and then you're just topping up during the race.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about, one, what carbohydrate loading even is, for those that haven't heard, and two, how that's then done effectively depending on the length of the race, because I'm assuming then that would also differ.
Yeah, so there are some really, really good research papers out there about all these protocols. So if you do want to go look them up, I'm sure I could send Johnny some links that he could maybe put in some show notes. But yeah, like people like Louise Burke have done some fantastic research into this area. But the aim of carbohydrate loading is to put you in the best possible starting point in terms of energy stores that you've got in your body. So what you want to do is you want to have sufficient carbohydrate stores in your muscles, and you also want to have sufficient carbohydrate stores in your liver. And then you want a little bit just kind of floating around in your blood, sort of ready to use, that you don't have to release from your muscles or your liver, like it's kind of just ready to go.
Mhm.
So we're going to do that. Over the period of a few days, you can replenish muscle glycogen stores, which is the stored carbohydrate in your muscle. So you do that by increasing carbohydrate intake over the period of 1 to 2 to 3 days while tapering. So that's reducing your energy expenditure through exercise. Because if you're upping your carbohydrate intake, but then you start being like, oh, I feel great, and then go for a long run, you're just going to deplete all that carbohydrate that you've reloaded into your muscles. So it's all about filling up your stores. So think of your body like a store cupboard. So you need to put loads of you need to put pasta in the cupboard to be ready for when you need to get it out and use it.
Yeah.
And then your liver is kind of like the fridge, as in like it doesn't hang around there as much, but you might put, don't know what's carbohydrate that goes
Some fresh carbohydrate in there,
you might
like
put some
fresh
fresh
pasta.
carbohydrate. Fresh pasta goes in the fridge,
Fruit.
dried pasta.
Yeah.
And then you've got a little bit that's just kind of sat out on the side that you're going to use immediately before you go into the fridge in the cupboard.
Yes.
I don't know if that was
No,
really
that was a really good analogy. No, I like that. That was good. That was good. I like that. And the mention of tapering during that time is good as well, because as you said,
Yeah.
you'll feel better from doing this, but you need to resist that temptation to train.
Yeah. And the amount that you take on, a lot of it depends on how much you can tolerate.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you don't even have to be that scientific with it. It helps to have a good idea of how much carbohydrate you're taking on. So you can, the recommendation tends to be 6 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight per day as a carbohydrate load. And you can split that up over a few days, because this dose will accumulate. So on day one, you might put 5 grams per kilogram in, and you've got that one building block. And then on day two, you've probably used a little bit of that, so you might be down to 4 grams per kilogram. And then you just add another building block of 6 grams per kilogram on top of that, and then you stack it up again and try not to use that carbohydrate too much.
Yeah.
By refraining from higher intensity activities.
And that's a lot of carbohydrate.
It is a lot of carbohydrate. For
And
a 100
so
kilogram person, that's a kilogram
of
of
carbs,
carbs.
and you know, we have to then be aware of getting that from carbohydrate and keeping our fat intake reasonably low, which
Yeah.
itself is a mission.
Yes, it is, which means that instead of when people go, oh, can I talk about another part of carb loading before we move on to that?
Oh yeah.
So there's also like immediately prior to exercise having 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight, about 1 to 4 hours, which again is one of those really loose recommendations. 1 to 4 hours before exercise.
Yeah.
So essentially that's your breakfast on race day. And that tops up those liver glycogen stores that probably get used overnight. So that's the first port of call essentially for when you start exercising. It's like, oh, this liver glycogen is available, we'll just use that first, and then we'll tap into muscle stores.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I was actually going to mention, you know, before we go into like the carbohydrate source, it's like for people listening to this, they think like flipping heck, like 6 to 10 grams of grams per kilo of body weight over 2 to 3 days. That's so much. Like, surely that's going to be too much, I'm sure, is what's in their head. Like, how much can the body even store?
Oh God, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head.
I think it's like 15 grams per kilo, is it?
I think it's
in the
something
muscles
like that. You can store you have enough, or you can store enough to sustain exercise for about an hour and a half to 2 hours.
And it's mental that that's that much that only sustains that much activity. You're like, yes. Wow.
But that's purely using carbohydrates. So you will use other fuel sources. So you use fat as a fuel source, even at the higher intensity of exercise. So depending on your exercise intensity, those stores might last a little bit longer. They might not last as long. But yeah, it purely depends on the exercise. If you're at a lower, you tend to use about 60% fat, 40% carbohydrate at rest.
Right.
as a fuel oxidation. Obviously, that's a kind of a ratio or a proportion. So 60% of not burning a whole lot of energy because you sat on your bum at your laptop is not a lot. And then 40% of that not a lot is even less than the fat. So if you're burning, I don't know, 10 calories or whatever in however long you're sat there, 6 of those will come from fat and 4 of those will come from carbohydrate, which is 1 gram of carbohydrate, which is not a lot at all.
No. Yeah.
So
Good point.
yeah, there are different fractions depending on your exercise intensity. So the fat oxidation will come down and the carbohydrate oxidation will go up as the exercise intensity increases.
Yes, that's a good point. As you're more intense, your carbohydrate oxidation
Utilization.
increases. Yeah,
Yeah.
you use more carbs, and
And I
that's a
think,
good
as you
point.
mentioned earlier, you use more if it's hot as well,
Yeah, which is
which is,
interesting.
it is super interesting. So if you're doing a marathon in the desert or in like Dubai or something, I don't know why anybody would want to do that.
People do though for whatever reason.
Then you might need a whole lot more. You might need to be towards that 90 grams per hour.
You'll need more carbs, but even though in another marathon you might need fewer, which is a good point.
Yeah.
And so talk to us about that, Charlotte, because you mentioned there like your intensity dictates the fuel source.
Yes, it
And
does.
so there are a lot of people that talk about fat usage for endurance exercise. And I guess
Yeah.
what you could say there is that because their argument is that endurance is aerobic, and then
Yeah.
aerobic metabolism is mostly fueled by fat stores. But you've then got to think, well, actually, depending on the intensity of this exercise, that's going to make the difference. So if you, I mean, I'm sure you'll talk about walking versus running, but
Yeah.
we mentioned earlier about people of different fitness levels. If
Yeah.
I'm running a marathon, it's probably going to be a hell of a lot more intense for me than someone who's much fitter than me if we were running the same pace. So
Yeah.
there's those differences, I guess, as well.
But it also then depends on things like what percentage of your VO2 max you're working at. So your VO2 max is kind of the maximal something oxygen that you can intake and utilize per minute, I want to say. I'm probably not the best person for exercise physiology type stuff like that. Yeah, VO2 max is a measure of fitness. Let's just kind of say that. So the
Yeah.
higher your VO2 max, the fitter you tend to be and the more efficiently you tend to use oxygen or can take in and use it. So yeah, it all depends on what percentage of your VO2 max you're working at. So if you have someone with a VO2 max of 30, which is quite low, and they're working reasonably hard, you can still be working at the same percentage of VO2 max, just at different paces. So their, I don't know, 7 minutes per kilometre pace might be 65% of their VO2 max, and someone's who's a lot more elite, someone with a VO2 max of 60, I'm pulling these numbers out of thin air, so don't take them as gospel, but
Yeah.
someone whose VO2 max is 55, 60, say, their 65% of their VO2 max might be doing 4 minutes 30 per kilometre. So it's less about pace and more about your exercise intensity. Kind of forgotten the question.
It's but it's exercise intensity dictates the fuel source. Is that thing? So
Dictates the
like,
fuel source massively. So
right.
as you kind of go over about 55% VO2 max, you swap to the predominant fuel source being carbohydrate.
Great point. So it's about eating enough fat, but knowing that carbohydrate is still going to be the main driver
It's
when your
going to be the main
intensity
fuel source.
reaches a certain
Yeah.
level.
So there's so much debate about this in the performance nutrition world, and I spent a lot of time looking at this during my masters. So something that a lot of researchers and I personally have noted about these people that go, no, go keto to run better marathons. Very few of these are elite runners, and that's just an interesting observation.
Yeah.
So yes, you can go high fat, low carbohydrate and run a marathon, but there's very little, if any, research, and most of the research that shows improvements in performance is very flawed.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's very little evidence that going high fat, low carbohydrate can improve performance, and in a lot of places it might even impair it. And then even then, you have to look at the methods that they've used, because a lot of researchers will use time to exhaustion as a measure of performance. And if you think about it, if you're running a marathon, the whole point is to not be exhausted at the end of it. You're not meant to run until you collapse. You're running a set distance. So using things like time trials is probably way more accurate. But yeah, in these time, and a lot of races have these critical points in them, so critical parts of the race, like sprint finishes or hanging on to a breakaway group. And that means that you need to be able to tap into those higher intensities of exercise, and you might not be able to perform better at those higher intensities if you don't have the available carbohydrate to do so.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's what you said there is like, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah.
Because it
So,
depends what your purpose for running that is. Like if your purpose is just to survive the race, then you can do an ultra on keto,
yeah.
but you'll just do it really slowly.
Yeah. So
Whereas if your goal is max performance, you'll need both.
do it with the carbohydrates. So even if you fully restore carbohydrate, because so researchers went, oh, we can adapt you to using more fat, but you seem to do that at the expense of being able to use carbohydrates. That reduces this thing called metabolic flexibility,
Yeah,
which
great
is the
point.
ability to swap between fuel sources. So researchers went, okay, cool. So we've adapted these people to high fat. Now let's see if we can restore all this carbohydrate, and then they can use the carbohydrate again as well. And they realized that even if you fully restore carbohydrate, after adapting to high fat, low carbohydrate, you still have this reduced ability to use the carbohydrate, which
Right.
is a
Yeah.
huge problem.
Yeah, because then they have to basically just train to use it again. So
Yeah.
if people are listening to this, trying to go high fat, just note that it comes at a cost.
Yeah. So it might preserve the ability to do submaximal, what am I trying to say? Submaximal exercise. But this comes at the expense of the higher intensities. So
Yeah.
you might be able to go for longer at like a really tootly pace, which, for an ultramarathon might be amazing. That might be exactly what you need.
Mhm.
But it then makes it harder to get to these higher intensities that you might need to do if you're really racing.
Yes.
So it
Yeah.
depends on your priority.
Exactly. It depends on whether you're doing it just to get through the race or whether you're doing it to perform at the elite level.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're
Then,
doing it just to get through, it's fine. Like,
yeah, you
do
can
what you
kind of
want.
just do what you want.
Do what you want.
You don't particularly even have to carb load, if you're just doing it to get through it. Your
Yeah.
life will probably be a lot nicer if you do carb load and if you
Mhm.
do eat carbohydrates during the event, but you can probably get through a marathon without eating that much.
Mhm.
So I've done marathons previously where I didn't intend to do a marathon. So the first time I ran a marathon, that sounds bizarre, doesn't it? The first
Yeah.
time I ran a marathon,
Just accidentally ran a marathon.
the first time I ran one, I was going to run to this little village and get the bus back. And then I asked in the corner shop, I was like, so I've been at the bus stop for like half an hour and there's no buses that have come past. And they was like, oh, the bus service got cancelled like 5 years ago because no one ever used it. I was like, oh. And I'd just run a half. So I was like, well, I either have to run the half back to Loughborough or I have to run another like 10 miles to Leicester, which I might as well just run back to Loughborough. So I got a snack of like a cereal bar and I ran an entire marathon on a cereal bar and some water. And it's doable. I hated it. It was awful, but you can do it because you'll eventually you'll start using these fat stores that you've got. But yeah, life lessons. Check that the bus actually runs before you decide to get the bus back when you're running out.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the most enjoyable weekend activity to
It
accidentally
wasn't.
run a marathon, which is funny. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's a good point. And to make, as you said there, like it's going to depend on the intensities you're running at. It depends on your goal. And so, you've then got to weigh these things up and think what it is you're trying to achieve. And then you can make the decision. But it's knowing that carbohydrates rule. So suck on that.
Yeah. There's a time and a place for low carbohydrate training though. So you do get some benefits of training every now and again with low carbohydrate availability. So that might be, or having lower carbohydrate availability available, because you improve things like mitochondrial biogenesis, and which is the number of mitochondria that you have, which means you can perform aerobic respiration more effectively, which is the respiration type that you use while you're running. And then you can do things like upregulate the enzymes that are involved in fat metabolism. So that might then make it easier to metabolize fat while you're running without the expense of reducing carbohydrate oxidation. So you don't get the same effects as if you went high fat, low carb, but you do get some of the benefits. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. So you can use things like training low, so training after, like without breakfast, just fasted training. And then you can use things like recovering low. So you might go for a run and then not eat afterwards, not replenish carbohydrate afterwards. You can eat, but you'd have a fat and protein focused meal. And then you can do things like sleeping low. So you might train, eat, but have like a low carbohydrate meal before bed, and then sleep, and then wake up and either train or have some carbohydrate and then train.
Yeah, so like that's a good point. In that if you wanted to, you can train with low carbohydrate availability or recover
Yeah,
with low carbs, and that'll improve your oxidation of fat, which will therefore improve your aerobic metabolism and improve your usage of that
yeah,
without sacrificing the ability to use carbs when you need to.
yeah,
So
exactly.
it's funny because it's just like, have a balance. Who'd have
Yeah,
thought it? Have a balance. That's the key.
yeah. I think a lot of people would be surprised at how little kind of the elite runners monitor their nutrition that closely in the way they just know. It's like, cool, carbohydrates are good for running, therefore I'm going to put carbohydrates in this meal. How many? Some. Like, how many? Lots.
Yeah,
How far do we run today? 22 miles. Cool. Let's have lots of carbohydrates. This is a
yeah,
big spoonful of pasta. And it becomes a lot more arbitrary, and you get to learn what your body needs and how well it runs on what foods.
yeah. I love that because it's like we've become a world that's so obsessed with the specifics and so obsessed with the data. Whereas actually, like, as you said there, if you use that mindset of your carbohydrates are your fueling
Mm-hmm.
macronutrient. So on days where you run less, have less of them. On
Yeah.
days where you run more, have more of them.
Mm-hmm.
On days where you do no running, don't have none of them, but just think about the amount you have with relation to other foods,
Yeah.
and then you'll probably work it
You'll
out.
probably be all right. And even you said then, like, even on days when you run less, if you have a massive run coming up the next day,
You might want more.
you might want more.
Yeah, because then that's fueling, like you're almost doing a mini load
Yeah. It's
because
just
you're
being
preparing for.
proactive, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just being aware of what you're doing. And I
Yeah.
think, as you said there, people over time will get a better awareness as long as they actually mindfully do these things. If they
Yeah.
measure them and if they're aware of what they're doing, they'll be able to optimize the strategy for them,
Yeah.
which is what's so important rather than just blindly following what someone else does who's got a different training status, a different body weight, and a different goal.
Yeah, I think there's kind of tiers of optimal. So it would probably be most optimal to be able to track everything you eat and then optimize your carbohydrate intake and be like, cool, say the 7 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate day, and then do that and track it all.
Mm.
But I don't have time to do that. A lot of people don't want to do that. The whole reason that I run is for enjoyment. And as soon as I start trying to put those rigid numbers on it, it just, the enjoyment goes out the window. Yeah, if I'm doing a 3-day carbohydrate load, I might be more conscious of the carbohydrate content of meals, but I don't think tracking it to the gram is on most people's priority list.
No.
So there's this, as we discussed kind of before we started recording, this trade-off between optimal and achievable. So then like the next tier down
Mm.
would be, I'm conscious of my carbohydrate intake. I know what foods are high carbohydrate. I know roughly kind of what 50 grams of carbohydrate looks like, and I can pop that into a meal. I know that if I have this meal, then this will help me recover afterwards. And just having that awareness of high carbohydrates, like some people might use protein as like a non-tracking mechanism, like focus on protein and carbs, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you then have the people that go, well, if I can't track ultimately epically properly, then might as well just not do anything. And that's probably like a bad way to look at it. Just go for the next tier up if you can.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good point because, as you said, some people will be more of the personality to like track and measure
Yeah,
and want to spend that time, whereas other people won't. And then it doesn't mean that just because you can't means that anything is futile.
yeah,
It just means that you're aware of like what you and I have said in terms of energy needs and carbohydrate needs,
mm-hmm.
and then you estimate and adjust based on how you feel and the results that you get.
Yeah. Like
Because even
if you
if you're
can't do
tracking,
anything,
you'd have
don't
to
do
do that.
anything.
Yeah, because even if you were tracking, you'd have to do that anyway. You'd
Yeah,
adjust based on results and how you felt.
yeah, you might realize that 6 grams per kilogram isn't enough, and you
Mm,
actually need 7 or 8.
mm,
Which
yeah,
case you up it to that, which is
exactly. And
a
you've got
less counting way to do it.
yeah, exactly. And then you've got Candy King on speed dial as you need just to get in sheer amounts of carbohydrates.
Yeah.
Charlotte, like I'm conscious of your time. I think there was the only one thing I had left to ask, which was about supplementation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the thing that people always start with, whereas it should be the kind of like last tool in the tool belt. We've already
Yeah.
mentioned gels and electrolytes and things like
Yeah.
that, but is there anything else that people could consider to give them an extra edge, or that they should be taking?
The mini bars of Saurine is 100%. That's like my performance nutrition supplement is Saurine loaves. That's what I use when I'm out running.
I lived on them when I was CrossFitting.
They're
Those at
great.
competitions were perfect.
They're amazing because they're dense, but they're energy dense and they don't sit too bad. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not a supplement, Saurine. If I could be sponsored by Saurine though, if they hear
I'll
this,
get in contact them and get them to sponsor this episode
yeah, I
because
think they should.
Yeah,
sponsored by Saurine.
that would be epic, wouldn't it?
Um,
I'll send them an email. It'd be funny to see what they reply.
that'd be hilarious. But yeah, as you mentioned, supplements are the sprinkles on top of the cake. They're not the eggs, flour, and butter that you put in the cake. They should be used to top up your performance. We use a food first approach always, and then
Yeah.
use supplements to help out. It's like gels are great, but I'd see them as more of a performance food rather than a
Hmm.
supplement, similar to whey protein. So there are a few supplements that are really helpful for endurance performance. So it's things like caffeine is a really great one. It can help delay fatigue. It can help reduce it can help spare glycogen by increasing fat oxidation and things like that. And it just helps you stay way more alert and way more aware, because there's nothing it's dangerous is running when you're tired, especially if you're doing things like trail racing or stuff like that, and you're going to end up falling off the side of a trail. Caffeine is just super useful, and then decreases rate of perceived exertion, so it decreases how hard it feels like you're working. So it's an all-round amazing supplement. 2 to 6 milligrams per kilo, about 30 to 60 minutes before you go. Use it acutely. Don't take too much all at once, because you'll have to stop for a poo within like an hour of starting, and that's not a good look for anybody who's stopping for a wild poo on the side of the road.
Yeah, no.
And then you've got other things that can be useful. Again, this depends on your event. So beta-alanine and sodium bicarb are both buffers that can be used. So one's an intracellular buffer, one's an extracellular buffer. So they both have different mechanisms of action, but achieve the same results of they prevent that burning feeling if you're doing high intensity stuff.
Hmm.
So if you are doing things like 8 or 1500, or even at a push like a 3 to 5k, they might help to buffer some hydrogen ions, which prevents accumulation of lactate, which kind of stops your legs from like cramping up. So it delays that fatigue again. And then things like creatine is a really good one just for things like recovery, might make you a little bit heavier, but there's been quite a bit of research that shows that the performance benefits of taking creatine outweighs the performance decrement of being like a kilo or 2 heavier.
Mm.
So yeah, that's my third one that I'd recommend. Don't bother loading it. Just take 5 grams a day.
Yeah,
You
forever.
can load it if you really want. Just take 5 grams a day. It'll
Just
accumulate
don't.
over time.
Yeah.
Beta-alanine is a bit of a different one in that it helps if you load it. So you can, I think the dose is like 6.4 grams per day for 6 weeks. Split. You have to split the dose, because this is that horrible one that gives you that awful tingly feeling if you take too much. So you need to split the dose up into like 1.1 to 1.6 grams per day per dose, and then have that 4 to 6 times a day.
Yeah, I think it was like it was for you've got to load for like 4 to 10 weeks, haven't you? Of I think it's like, is it 8 milligrams per kilo or something like that?
So you have to reach an accumulative dose. So I always use 6.4 grams for 6 weeks, just because that's what Craig Sale, who is like the godfather of buffers, told me to do, which is about 40 grams is sort of the dose that you need, and then you can maintain that with about 1.2 to 1.6 grams.
Okay, yeah, good points.
So yeah, you have to just reach this cumulative dose. What was it that you said? Was it 8 grams?
I thought it was like 8 milligrams per kilo, but I might be. I think I was thinking of the MNU notes, but even then, I might have got that number wrong.
I might have just completely got mine. I've got a thingy here.
We'll double check, and we'll add it in. I've actually got the my little MNU document open next to me here. Beta-alanine.
Yeah, I've got 6.4 grams per day over 6 weeks.
Yeah, well, I think that's a much easier thing for people to take. And as you said there, like split it up. 80 milligrams per kilo is what I've got. Yeah, but 6.4 grams for saturation. That's a good point.
80 milligrams is 8 grams, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. 0.8.
0.8 grams.
0.8 grams. But 6.4 grams as a total is a good thing to say. And as you said, split it up, because otherwise the tingling effect will be so crazy. You'll feel like Spider-Man.
Yeah. The 6.4 grams is a really good coverall for everybody as well. And if you're a bit smaller, you might need a bit less. As in so if I was going to take it, 0.8 times 60 is 48. So I'd need 48 grams.
4.8.
4.8 even, not 48. Quick maths.
Yeah.
2 so quick.
1 plus 1 is 2. 2 plus 2 is 4. That's quick maths. I love that song. Anyway, no, Charlotte, there's been some great points here. If people want to find out more about you, where can they go?
The best place is probably my Instagram. So I'm at charlotte.f.nutrition, or you can drop me an email charlottefisher.nutrition@gmail.com. No, I haven't paid for Google Business yet. I feel like I'm still quite good at nutrition without having paid for it, so I'm doing all right at the moment.
That was a quip from me for
It
anyone that's
was.
wanting to know.
Yeah, so I work with athletes. I've worked with professional athletes previously. I worked with recreational athletes. I also work with general population people. I do a lot with people at the moment who have come into quarantine and gone, oh, you know, it'd be really cool to start running because the gyms are shut. So if
Yeah.
you're one of those people, I'm your gal for that.
Hit Charlotte up, yeah.
Yeah, and then I help people with things like muscle gain, weight loss, a few chronic conditions like type 2 diabetes and PCOS. I'm good with. Yeah, I'm a bit of a jack of all trades when it comes to nutrition, but definitely specialise in the sporting stuff. So
Awesome.
yeah, hit me up.
Yeah, I'll put your details in the notes. Charlotte, thanks again for coming on. I've really enjoyed this chat.
I really enjoyed it as well. I love chatting about nutrition. I could do it all day.
Well, we'll definitely do it again.
100%. Thank you very much.